Imagine you're at a packed football stadium on a crisp Sunday afternoon.
Right, just a normal weekend.
Exactly. 10,000 people are cheering. The air is thick with anticipation. It's that kind of communal joy you only really get at a major sporting event.
Yeah, everyone's just relaxed and having a good time.
But then suddenly, a plane circles low overhead and drops a red flare. And without a single warning, armed police just storm the turnstiles and open fire on the crowd.
It's just unthinkable.
It is. 90 seconds later, 14 people are dead, including children who were literally just sitting on the walls watching the game.
God.
And look, this isn't a dystopian movie. This actually happened. And the most terrifying part isn't just that it happened, but that the state apparatus responsible immediately went to work to ensure no one would ever be held accountable.
Yeah, it really shatters that fundamental illusion of safety,
Absolutely.
Because you mentioned Sunday. Culturally, historically, Sunday is insulated. It's the day of rest, the Sabbath. It's supposed to be a sanctuary from the chaos of the work week.
Right, a safe space.
Exactly. And when a state introduces extreme lethal brutality into that specific space, it violates a very deep psychological boundary. It turns the mundane into the unimaginable.
Well, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are going on a really harrowing journey into Ireland's history.
We are.
Our mission today is to examine the specific, granular details across 3 distinct days spanning over half a century. And all 3 of these days bear the exact same tragic moniker.
Bloody Sunday.
Right, Bloody Sunday. We're looking at events in 1913, 1920, and 1972.
Which is a huge span of time.
It is. And I want to be incredibly clear up front before we really get into it. While these events hold immense historical and political symbolism, this deep dive is going to focus intensely on the darker aspects.
The realities on the ground.
Exactly. We're looking squarely at the actual crimes, the severe violence, the brutality inflicted upon citizens, and that shocking lack of accountability that followed. We're going to examine how state power operates when it's caught with blood on its hands.
And, we have to note that we're dealing with over a century of deeply entrenched, highly politically charged conflict here.
Right, between Irish nationalists, unionists, and the British state.
Exactly. So our goal today isn't to take a side or litigate the politics of it all.
No, not at all. We are strictly acting as impartial reporters today.
Right.
We aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoint. We're just looking at what the records, the ballistics, the eyewitness testimonies, and the secret inquiries actually show.
We're just looking at the mechanics of the violence and the visceral realities of these events.
Yeah, just the facts from our source stack. And speaking of, to do this, we are pulling from a massive stack of sources today.
It's a lot to get through.
It really is. We have historical analyses of the 1913 Dublin lockout. We've got detailed operational breakdowns of the intelligence war and the massacres of 1920.
And the exhaustive forensic findings of the civil inquiry into the 1972 Derry shootings.
Right. We even have the records of British military tribunals from 1920 that were literally kept locked in a filing cabinet, just hidden from the public for over 80 years.
Which is wild. It's a vast amount of material, but it all points to a single recurring pattern of behavior.
It really does. So let's start unraveling that pattern. We're going to begin in Dublin, August 31st, 1913.
Okay.
To understand the violence of this first Bloody Sunday, we have to understand the pressure cooker that was Dublin at the time.
Okay.
We are right in the middle of a massive labor dispute known as the Dublin Lockout.
Yeah, and you really have to picture the socioeconomic reality of Dublin in 1913 to grasp this.
Set the scene for us.
Well, it was a city of extremes. You had incredible wealth, but you also had some of the worst urban slums in all of Europe.
Like genuinely horrific conditions.
Absolutely. Entire families lived in single rooms in these decaying Georgian tenements. The infant mortality rate was just staggering. The workforce was largely unskilled, deeply impoverished, and frankly, easily exploited.
Enter Jim Larkin.
Right, Jim Larkin. He was this towering, charismatic labor organizer. He formed the Irish Transport and General Workers Union and started organizing these unskilled workers.
And Larkin's primary weapon was something called the sympathetic strike, right?
Yes, exactly.
Like if you're listening and wondering what makes that different from a regular strike, think of it like a cascading domino effect.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, so if a factory owner fires one worker for joining the union doesn't just strike at that factory.
Right. The dock workers refused to load that factory's goods.
The railway workers refused to transport them. The tram drivers refused to take the scabs to work. It's a tactic designed to completely paralyze the local economy, until the employers cave.
That is the exact mechanism. And the employers, who were led by a very powerful businessman named William Martin Murphy, they realized how dangerous this was to their bottom line.
So they fight back.
They do. They form a cartel. Over 400 employers banded together and issued an ultimatum to the city's workforce. They basically said, resign from Larkin's union or you are locked out.
Wow.
Yeah, you lose your job, your income, and potentially your home. So tens of thousands of workers were suddenly on the streets. The city was at a complete standstill, and the tension was just unbearable.
Which brings us to this specific Sunday in August. Larkin is called for a massive rally on Sackville Street, which is now O'Connell Street.
The main thoroughfare of Dublin.
Right. Now, the government, fully backing the employers, they officially ban the meeting. They do not want Larkin speaking. They even issue a warrant for his arrest.
So the street is heavily policed.
Exactly. But it's also a Sunday. It's a beautiful afternoon. The street is packed not just with striking workers, but with thousands of people who are just out for a stroll after Mass.
Right, people returning from the park, standing around talking, just citizens.
Yeah. And Larkin, who had a real flair for the theatrical, he sneaks into the Imperial Hotel, which ironically was owned by his nemesis, William Martin Murphy.
That's amazing.
Right. He's wearing a disguise, too, a frock coat and a fake beard.
Naturally.
He steps out onto the balcony overlooking this crowded street, rips off the disguise, and shouts down to the crowd. It was this moment of incredible defiance. The crowd just roars.
But the focus of our deep dive isn't Larkin's speech, is it?
No, it's the horrific crime that follows. Because the authorities don't just send a few officers upstairs to quietly arrest a man for violating a speaking ban.
Not at all.
The Dublin Metropolitan Police, the DMP, and the Royal Irish Constabulary, the RIC, they launch a ferocious baton charge straight into this densely packed civilian street. They just laid into them.
And the word charge almost sanitizes it, really.
Yeah, it does.
It was a riot orchestrated by the police. The DMP were known for their physical size. They were large, imposing men armed with these heavy wooden batons. And when Larkin appeared, making a mockery of the police ban, the restraint just vanished.
They just snapped.
The sources make it painfully clear that this violence was entirely indiscriminate. They weren't carefully trying to arrest ringleaders. They were sweeping the street, just clubbing anyone in their path.
Men, women, children.
Elderly bystanders who had absolutely nothing to do with the union.
The accounts in the sources are sickening. People were struck from behind as they tried to run away. Hundreds were injured, just left bleeding on the pavement and taken to local hospitals with severe head trauma.
And there were fatalities.
Yes, we are talking about fatal beatings here. 2 men, James Nolan and James Byrne, were beaten so severely by the police over that weekend that they died from their injuries.
It's just horrific.
It is. The brutality was so intense, so public, that when Byrne's funeral was held shortly after, 3,000 defiant mourners marched behind Union bands just to show the state they wouldn't be cowed.
Wow.
So, yeah, we talk about workers striking in 1913, but the real story is the police just unleashing brutality on them. Is that really how a state should respond to social grievances?
Well, it is a profound failure of the social contract. But if we look at the mechanics of power, you see why it happened.
What do you mean?
The authorities at Dublin Castle didn't view these impoverished working-class citizens as a populace to be protected. They viewed them as a subversive contagion.
A threat.
Exactly. The government firmly supported the employers because the employers represented stability and capital. So the police were unleashed essentially as a paramilitary force to protect the economic status quo.
Jeez.
The baton charge wasn't about crowd control. It was a punitive measure. It was designed to terrorize the working class into submission.
But why did the state feel justified in unleashing such violence on people simply trying to secure better conditions? Where's the justice for the victims of that police brutality?
There was no justice.
None.
None. That is the tragedy of 1913. The police who beat James Nolan and James Byrne to death were never held accountable. The state effectively sanctioned the violence by just ignoring it.
That's so grim.
It is. However, the legacy of that unchecked brutality actually changed the course of Irish history. It proved to the labor leaders, specifically a man named James Connolly, that the state would happily murder unarmed workers to protect property.
Right.
So Connolly realized the workers needed to be able to shoot back. That realization directly led to the formation of the Irish Citizen Army, which was an armed workers' militia created specifically to defend picket lines from police violence.
So the violence just begat more violence.
Exactly. The state's refusal to police itself birthed an armed rebellion.
The state learned a very dangerous lesson in 1913, didn't they? That they could unleash police forces on a civilian crowd and successfully just wave it away.
Yes, they did.
But the populace learned a lesson too. And when we look at our next Bloody Sunday, we see the terrifying evolution of that dynamic.
We move forward 7 years.
Right. It is 1920. The Irish War of Independence is raging. We've transitioned from police batons clearing a street to a cold, calculated, lethal intelligence war.
The violence has escalated dramatically.
It's the morning of Sunday, November 21st, 1920. What's the situation?
Well, by late 1920, the conflict in Dublin is largely invisible. It's a shadow war fought in alleyways, safe houses, and pubs.
Yeah.
Michael Collins, who was the director of intelligence for the IRA, recognized a fundamental truth about British rule in Ireland. It relied almost entirely on a highly sophisticated network of spies, informants, and intelligence officers.
Right, because you can't defeat the British Empire in a pitched battle.
But Collins realized you didn't have to.
Exactly. Think of British intelligence in 1920 not as, like, James Bond spies running around with gadgets, but as a giant, incredibly efficient filing cabinet.
That's exactly what it was.
They were gathering names, addresses, routines, connections. And Collins realized you can't fight a filing cabinet with a traditional army. You fight it by blinding the clerks who organize the files.
Right. He knew that if the British identified his men, the rebellion was over.
So the British brought in their own elite undercover operatives to hunt Collins down, a group the IRA referred to as the Cairo Gang.
Because many had served in British military intelligence in the Middle East.
Or maybe just because they hung out at the Cairo Cafe in Dublin. Either way, Collins decides to execute a decapitation strike, a meticulously planned operation to wipe them out all at once on a Sunday morning.
And the logistics of this operation are just staggering.
How do they pull it off?
Collins utilized a vast network of informants, many of whom were domestic servants. You know, maids, cooks, porters working in the high-end boarding houses where these British officers lived.
Hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. The IRA tracked their movements for weeks. And then at 9 a.m. sharp on that Sunday, roughly 100 members of the IRA's Dublin Brigade and Collins' elite assassination unit, known as the Squad, struck simultaneously.
Across over a dozen different addresses in the fashionable south inner city of Dublin.
Yes.
But we have to look at the grisly, terrifying reality of these acts.
Yeah.
Because, while history books often frame this as a brilliant tactical victory for the IRA, the actual mechanics of the morning are horrifying.
They really are.
This wasn't a battlefield skirmish where soldiers are exchanging fire from trenches. This was men bursting into bedrooms while people were still in their pajamas.
14 men are killed that morning.
Let's look at the specifics. Like Captain William Frederick Newberry at 92 Lower Bagot Street. He and his wife are in their room. They hear the front door crashing down. Heavy footsteps on the stairs.
It's terrifying.
They try to barricade themselves in their bedroom. Newberry realizes what's happening. He tries to scramble out of his window to escape, and he is shot dead right there on the window ledge by the assassins who break the door down.
And his pregnant wife watches in horror.
It's just awful. Or consider the scene at 38 Upper Mount Street. The IRA attackers enter the house and force a domestic maid at gunpoint to show them which rooms Lieutenant Ames and Captain Bennett are staying in.
And the sheer terror inflicted on those domestic workers is a critical part of the violence here.
Absolutely. The officers are pulled out of bed, made to stand facing the wall, and just executed.
It's completely ruthless.
It is. And it forces us to look at how these calculated political killings dramatically escalated the conflict and entirely blurred the lines of war.
Because it wasn't just intelligence operatives who died.
No. When you send dozens of armed men into civilian boarding houses on fragmented intelligence, you get horrific collateral damage.
You do.
Look at Captain Patrick McCormack. He was staying at the Gresham Hotel. He wasn't a spy. He was a Catholic veterinary officer in the Royal Army Veterinary Corps.
He was literally just in Ireland to buy horses for the military.
Exactly. The assassins knocked on his door, pretended to have dispatches for him, got him to open up, and shot him in his bed. Collins later quietly admitted the intelligence was wrong. McCormack was a mistake.
It highlights the inherent chaos of utilizing terror to frighten an administration. When you bring the war into the bedrooms of the city, precision is often an illusion. You end up with the deaths of men like McCormack or the two auxiliaries, Cadets Garnis and Morris. They weren't targets. They just happened to be walking down the street, heard the gunfire, and were shot dead trying to run for help to raise the alarm.
So for the IRA, these were acts of war necessary to survive. They believed that if they didn't kill the Cairo gang would torture and kill them.
Which was probably true.
Right. But practically, they effectively erased the lines between combatant and civilian targets. They utilized extreme brutality.
And by the time Dublin fully woke up and the news spread, the psychological shock was total.
The streets emptied.
The air was thick with the anticipation of a reprisal.
And that reprisal came with terrifying speed.
It did, which brings us to the afternoon of that very same day, November 21st, 1920.
Right.
The morning's targeted bloodshed was met with a massive, completely indiscriminate response by the state apparatus.
Over at Croke Park Stadium, just a couple of miles away from where the morning assassinations took place, a crowd of about 10,000 people has gathered.
For a Gaelic football match.
Yeah, it's a challenge match between Dublin and Tipperary. Now, if you're not familiar with the GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Association, it's important to understand that it's not just a sports league. It is deeply intertwined with Irish cultural identity.
Very much so.
The match that day was a fundraiser for the Republican Prisoners Dependence Fund. So, yes, there's anxiety in the air because of the morning's news, and the crowd is largely nationalist in its sympathies. But people are there with their children to watch a game.
But meanwhile, over at Dublin Castle, the seat of British administration, there is absolute panic and rage.
Because their elite intelligence network has just been butchered in their beds.
Exactly. They want to hit back. So they dispatch a heavily armed mixed force to the stadium. This force includes the regular police, the military, and two highly controversial paramilitary police units, the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans.
Okay, we need to explain who the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries were, because they are central to understanding the brutality of what happens next. They weren't regular beat cops.
Not at all. Because the IRA had been successfully assassinating regular police officers and forcing them to resign, the British government desperately needed recruits.
So who do they get?
They turned to unemployed veterans returning from World War I.
Oh, wow.
These were men who had survived the horrors of the trenches. Many were deeply traumatized, suffering from what we would now call PTSD.
Right.
They were hastily trained, put into a mix of dark police uniforms and khaki military trousers, hence the nickname Black and Tans, and dropped into Ireland.
And they're essentially given a civilian policing role, but they brought a brutal, combat-oriented mindset.
Exactly. They operated with virtually zero oversight and had already established a horrific reputation for burning down civilian towns as reprisals.
So you have this furious, heavily armed, traumatized paramilitary force rolling up to a crowded sports stadium.
A recipe for disaster.
Completely.
Yeah.
The official plan, allegedly, was to encircle Croke Park, use an officer with a megaphone to announce that all males would be searched for weapons, and try to catch any IRA men who might have sought refuge in the crowd.
But that is not what happened.
Not even close. Before the match has even fully gotten underway, an airplane flies low over the stadium. It circles twice and drops a red flare.
This is the signal.
Yes. But without a single warning, without any megaphone announcement, without any provocation, police storm the turnstiles at the canal end of the stadium and immediately open fire into the crowd and onto the players on the pitch.
The mechanics of the massacre are laid out in the eyewitness accounts, including those hidden in secret British military inquiries for decades. It was absolute carnage.
It's just devastating.
For 90 seconds, there was continuous, sustained shooting. Let me emphasize that. A minute and a half of lethal fire into a dense, trapped crowd of civilians.
My God.
The records show 228 rounds of small arms ammunition were fired by the police inside the ground. Outside, an armored car with machine gun fired another 50 rounds over the heads of the fleeing crowd to stop people from escaping down the street.
It's almost unimaginable. I mean, try to picture the stampede. 10,000 people trapped in an enclosed space while high-velocity rifle rounds are tearing through the stands.
A complete panic.
Over on the Cusack stand side, hundreds of spectators are braving a 20-foot drop, jumping blindly into the Belvedere sports grounds next door just to escape the bullets.
People are being trampled and crushed in the narrow exit passages.
And when the dust settles, 14 people are dead. 14. Including Michael Hogan, the Tipperary player, who was shot dead while crawling off the pitch in his team jersey.
When you look at who actually died at Croke Park, any claim that this was a targeted anti-terrorist operation completely falls apart.
Yeah. The victims perfectly illustrate the indiscriminate nature of a state-sanctioned massacre.
You have Jane Boyle, a 26-year-old woman who was at the match with her fiancé. They were due to be married the following week. She was crushed in the stampede and shot in the back.
And the children. This is the part that just stops you in your tracks.
It's heartbreaking.
Jerome O'Leary, a 10-year-old boy. He was shot dead while simply sitting on a wall watching the game. Perry Robinson, an 11-year-old boy, shot dead from a bridge outside while trying to run away. William Billy Scott, a 14-year-old boy, shot in the chest.
It's just horrific.
That Croke Park massacre in 1920, I mean, opening fire on civilians at a GAA match, that's not collateral damage. That is a state-sponsored crime against humanity, isn't it?
Under any definition of international law, yes, it was a mass reprisal against a civilian population. It was vengeance, pure and simple.
How does a nation justify retaliating against unarmed spectators for political assassinations they had nothing to do with? Isn't that a clear war crime?
They don't justify it, they lie about it.
Right.
The aftermath of Croke Park is a masterclass in state-sponsored cover-ups. Publicly, the British government immediately issued a statement blaming unknown civilian gunmen.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. They utilized their control of the telegraph lines out of Dublin to feed a narrative to the global press. They claimed that their forces were fired upon first by IRA men acting as pickets at the ticket gates, and that the police only returned fire in self-defense to prevent a breakout.
But the internal documents, the ones locked away for 80 years, showed that the military command knew exactly what had happened.
Exactly. The British held a military court of inquiry in lieu of public civilian inquests. They held it in secret, behind closed doors.
Convenient.
Very. And the documents from that inquiry were locked away in the Public Record Office in London. When they were finally released, they revealed that the military's own internal opinion, signed by Major General G.F. Boyd, concluded that the firing by the police was carried out without orders and was indiscriminate and unjustifiable.
Wow.
The military investigators noted that there were no casualties among the police to suggest they were under heavy fire.
The inquiry even noted that while some police fired into the air, others actively aimed into the crowd at people they believed were trying to evade arrest. One plainclothes officer actually admitted on the record to chasing young men across the grounds and emptying his service revolver into them simply because they were running away in a panic.
Just murder!
The state knew it was a crime. The military command knew their police forces had committed an unjustified massacre. Yet publicly, the imperative was to protect the narrative of the Crown forces fighting terrorists, rather than admit their own forces had engaged in terrorism.
It's the bureaucratic reflex to conceal. If you admit that your forces murdered a 10-year-old boy sitting on a wall, you lose the moral high ground required to govern.
Yeah.
So the lie becomes official policy.
Okay, let's take this step further, because the horrors of November 21st, 1920 didn't end when the sun went down.
No, they didn't.
The violence just moved from the public stadium into the locked, hidden reams of state power.
Yes, the third atrocity of that Bloody Sunday took place that evening inside the guardroom of Dublin Castle, which was the very nerve center of British administration, policing, and intelligence in Ireland.
Right, so the night before, on Saturday, two very high-ranking IRA officers had been captured in a raid. Dick McKee, the commandant of the Dublin Brigade, and Peter Clancy, his vice-commandant.
These were serious players.
These were the men who actually helped Michael Collins plan the morning assassinations. They were being held in the guardroom of the Auxiliaries of Company.
What was a third man?
Yes, with them was a third man, Connor Clune. Now, Clune is a deeply tragic figure here. He wasn't in the IRA. He was an innocent civilian, a manager of a seed nursery in County Clare, who had just traveled to Dublin for a co-op audit.
He just happened to be arrested in a raid on Vaughan's hotel because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
So you have these three men in total custody, in a locked room, surrounded by heavily armed, grieving, and furious auxiliaries who had just spent the morning collecting the bodies of their murdered comrades.
A very dangerous situation.
And what happens? All three men are shot dead in that guardroom.
And the official line issued from Dublin Castle the next day was one of the most notorious, thinly veiled euphemisms of the entire conflict.
Let me guess.
They said they were shot while trying to escape.
Unbelievable.
The authorities claimed the prisoners had noticed a pile of unsecured weapons, lunged for rifles, and even thrown a grenade that miraculously failed to detonate, forcing the guards to shoot them in self-defense.
They even went so far as to restage the scene the next day with actors for newspaper photographers to prove how the men had supposedly lunged for the guns.
It was a blatant, grotesque fabrication.
Because when the families finally received the coffins, the truth was horrifyingly clear.
The bodies showed severe signs of torture.
They had been beaten, bayoneted, and shot multiple times at close range. According to the mortuary attendants who prepared the bodies, Their faces were heavily bruised, and there were bayonet wounds to their abdomens.
It was extrajudicial murder.
It was calculated, vengeful slaughter by their captors. These men were defenseless prisoners. And this ties directly into the findings of the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland, which was a non-governmental body that conducted its own investigations at the time.
Right.
They issued a scathing report stating that British imperial forces were acting contrary to all law and standards of human conduct. They explicitly stated that the forces were inciting unbridled violence.
The American Commission didn't just look at Bloody Sunday either. They looked at the systemic behavior of the Crown forces.
What did they find?
They specifically highlighted how the British forces were indiscriminately killing civilians, torturing prisoners, adopting this absurd attempting to escape subterfuge to cover up assassinations, and just operating with total impunity.
And that's the core issue. The state's total failure to hold its own forces accountable for the massacre at Croke Park, or for the torture and murders of McKee, Clancy, and Clune in Dublin Castle. It didn't restore order. It did the exact opposite.
It deepened Irish resentment.
It proved to the population that the law didn't apply to the people holding the guns. It perpetuated the cycle of violence, ensuring the war would grind on for months in an even bloodier fashion. When the state refuses to prosecute its own war crimes, the population realizes they are on their own.
The British state learned a very dangerous lesson in 1920.
What with that?
That they could unleash elite military forces on a civilian crowd, orchestrate extrajudicial killings in their own guardrooms, and successfully cover it up with internal inquiries and compliant press releases.
The bureaucratic muscle memory of how to execute a whitewash was firmly established.
Exactly. So when civil unrest erupted half a century later, that exact same playbook was dusted off.
We are moving 52 years into the future. It's January 30, 1972. We are in Derry in Northern Ireland.
Once again, state forces are deployed against civilians on a Sunday.
But this time, there is no morning assassination by insurgents. The deaths are entirely one-sided, cementing this as the most notorious Bloody Sunday in global memory.
To understand the mechanics of the violence in Derry, you have to understand the context of the Troubles.
Right. Northern Ireland was highly polarized.
The Catholic nationalist community faced systemic discrimination in housing, voting, and employment. The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, Anwar Tara, emerged to protest these inequalities.
And by 1972, the British government had introduced a policy called internment without trial.
Which meant the military could arrest anyone suspected of being a paramilitary and hold them indefinitely in prison camps without ever charging them with a crime or bringing them before a judge.
It was overwhelmingly targeted at the Catholic community.
Oh.
And it was deeply reviled.
So Ang Ture organized a peaceful protest march in Derry.
It was to take place in the Bogside area, which was a sprawling, working-class, nationalist neighborhood that had effectively barricaded itself off from the police.
It was known as Free Derry.
The march was a civil rights demonstration. Tens of thousands of people, families, marching and singing.
The authorities decided to allow the march to proceed within the confines of the Bogside, but they set up heavy military barricades to stop it from reaching the city center.
However, the military command, specifically Major General Robert Ford, decided to use this protest as an opportunity.
He wanted to launch an aggressive arrest operation to scoop up the young men who routinely threw stones at the troops. The hooligans, as the army called them.
And to execute this arrest operation, Ford didn't send in riot police with shields and batons. He sent in the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment.
One para.
Yes, one para. We need to focus on this because it explains the brutality that follows. One para was not a riot control unit. They were an elite, highly aggressive combat unit.
They were the shock troops.
And they brought what historians call an imperial policing mindset into a civilian protest. They treated a domestic city in the UK like a hostile colonial outpost.
They had already been implicated in the shooting of 11 civilians in the Ballymurphy massacre in Belfast just months prior.
Dropping them into a tense civil rights march was like dropping a lit match into a powder keg.
Exactly. The commander of one para, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Wilford, was supposed to hold his position at the barricades, but just after 4 p.m., he deliberately disobeys orders from his superior to stay put.
He orders his paratroopers into their armored vehicles. They ran through the barricades and charged deep into the Bogside, right into the fleeing, panicked crowd.
The soldiers pour out of their vehicles and treat the civilian housing estate like a free-fire combat zone.
Without issuing a single warning, they drop to their knees, raise their high-velocity assault rifles, and opened fire.
They fired 108 live rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition.
Wow.
And this is high-velocity combat ammunition designed to punch through armor and concrete. They fired into terraced streets, flat complexes, and car parks filled with thousands of fleeing civilians.
13 people die that day. A 14th, John Johnston, is wounded and dies months later from his injuries.
We must demand that we focus on how these people died.
Yes.
Because the geometry of the shootings, the specific forensic details, expose the absolute horror of the crime. These weren't stray bullets catching people in a crossfire. These were deliberate executions.
The specifics are just harrowing.
They really are.
Listen to these cases. Jackie Duddy. He was 17 years old. He was running away from the soldiers across the courtyard of the Rossville Flats. A paratrooper shot him squarely in the back.
And there is iconic, heartbreaking footage of a local priest, Father Edward Daly, waving a blood-stained white handkerchief.
He wasn't surrendering. He was trying to escort the mortally wounded teenage boy to safety while the army continued to fire.
Or Bernard McGuigan, a 41-year-old father of 6. He saw another man lying wounded on the ground. McGuigan stepped out from cover to help him.
He was holding up a white handkerchief, explicitly showing he was unarmed and peaceful.
And a paratrooper took aim and shot him in the back of the head.
In Grenfada Park, a small, enclosed residential courtyard, the violence was even more predatory. Soldiers chased fleeing civilians into this boxed-in area and simply fired across the courtyard at them.
James Ray, 22 years old, he was shot in the back while running away in Glenfada Park.
He falls to the ground paralyzed. And as he is lying there, face down, mortally wounded on the pavement, a soldier walks up to him and shoots him a second time in the back at close range.
It's an execution.
Gerald McKinney, a 35-year-old father. Witnesses say he saw a soldier emerge into the courtyard. McKinney stopped, held his hands high in the air, and yelled, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!"
The soldier shot him in the chest from a few yards away.
The high-velocity bullet passed straight through his body and killed 17-year-old Gerald Donahue, who was standing behind him. Looking at Derry, it's not just that people died, it's how they died. Running away, trying to help others. What kind of rules of engagement allow soldiers to shoot unarmed civilians in the back?
There are no rules of engagement that permit it. It is a fundamental violation of both military law and human rights.
It's murder.
The Seville inquiry ultimately found that there was a serious and widespread loss of fire discipline. But to understand why it happened, you have to look at the culture of the unit.
Right.
Colonel Wilford unleashed soldiers who were psychologically primed for combat into a panicked crowd. They acted with an aggression that viewed the entire nationalist population as the enemy. Once the first shot was fired, they essentially engaged in a turkey shoot.
And the sinister actions of the state didn't stop when the guns cooled down. Because, just like in 1920, the immediate administrative reflex was to fabricate evidence to protect the military.
There were immediate, calculated cover-ups.
Take Gerald Donahue, the 17-year-old boy I just mentioned who was killed by the bullet passing through Gerald McKinney. After he was shot, bystanders rushed to him. They searched his pockets for ID to find out who he was.
A civilian doctor examined his body.
A soldier then drove his body to an Army aid post, where an Army medical officer pronounced him dead. Throughout all of this, nobody saw anything in his pockets. His jeans were tight-fitting.
But shortly after, when the body was in the sole custody of the security forces, they miraculously found 4 bulky nail bombs planted in his pockets.
It was a blatant, clumsy attempt to retroactively justify the murder of a teenager.
The Army had just shot 14 unarmed people in front of the world's media. They desperately needed some of them to be terrorists to explain why they were dead. Planting explosives on a corpse was a desperate act of narrative control.
This brings us to the overarching theme connecting all of these bloody Sundays.
Accountability.
Or, more accurately, the complete systemic lack thereof. We saw the secret military whitewash in 1920 with Croke Park. But in 1972, the British government had a problem.
They couldn't hide behind a secret inquiry.
Exactly. There were hundreds of journalists and TV cameras in the bogside. The world had watched it happen. So they couldn't bury it in silence. They had to construct a public whitewash. They set up the Widgery Tribunal.
The Widgery Tribunal is infamous in legal history. It was chaired by the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Widgery. This tribunal was initiated within days of the massacre and managed to produce its final report in just 11 weeks.
Which is insane.
It was an astonishingly brief timeline for a mass casualty event involving thousands of witnesses, complex ballistics, and deeply conflicting testimonies.
It was designed to clear the Army quickly. The result was a grotesque insult to the victims and their families.
Widgery largely cleared the soldiers. He accepted their completely false claims that they had only fired at unidentified gunmen and bomb throwers, despite the total lack of evidence, weapons, or military casualties.
Widgery wrote that while there was no proof the deceased were handling weapons, there was a strong suspicion that some of them were. He officially blamed the unarmed victims for their own murders.
The phrase, "Widgery washes whiter," was immediately painted on the gable walls in Derry. The nationalist community, and frankly anyone who looked objectively at the evidence, recognized it instantly as a state-sponsored whitewash.
And the consequences of this denial of justice were catastrophic. The MP Bernadette McAliskey noted that by exonerating the paratroopers, the British Army effectively declared war on people seeking justice through legal means.
Young men, enraged by the slaughter on their streets and the subsequent lies of the Widgery Report, literally queued up at safe houses to join the Provisional IRA.
Bishop Edward Daly, the priest waving the white handkerchief, wrote that countless young people were motivated to armed struggle directly because of Bloody Sunday and the Widgery cover-up.
The year 1972 became the bloodiest year of the Troubles, with 479 deaths.
The state's failure to provide justice didn't just hurt the families. It poured gasoline on the fire and fueled decades of paramilitary violence.
When the justice system is rigged to protect the state's agents, violence becomes the only perceived avenue for redress. It wasn't until 1998, as part of the Good Friday Agreement peace process, that a new inquiry was finally granted to correct the historical record.
The Seville inquiry.
Yes.
There were extensive investigations. What did they actually find? Why did it take so long to get even a glimpse of the truth about the crimes committed by British soldiers that day?
The Seville inquiry was the longest and most expensive public inquiry in British legal history. It took 12 years to complete. And the reason it took so long was because Lord Savile decided to do the forensic work that Widgery completely ignored. Right. The inquiry interviewed over 900 witnesses. They cross-referenced thousands of pages of documents. Crucially, they used modern technology.
How so?
They built a virtual reality computer model of the Bogside as it existed in 1972. They used audio analysis of the broadcast recordings to map the exact timing and location of the gunfire. They used trajectory analysis to map the sightlines of every single soldier who fired a weapon.
They literally recreated the crime scene digitally to test the soldiers' stories.
Exactly.
And what they found was a total repudiation of Widgery. Lord Savile concluded that the killings were unjustified and unjustifiable.
He confirmed that all the victims were unarmed.
That none posed a threat of causing death or serious injury, that no warnings were given before the soldiers opened fire, and crucially, that the soldiers knowingly put forward false accounts to justify their firing.
In plain English, they committed murder, and then they perjured themselves to cover it up.
12 years of exhaustive, multi-million-pound forensic investigation to finally confirm what the people of Derry, the eyewitnesses, and the victims' families knew on day one.
And the publication of the report led to the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, standing up in the House of Commons and formally apologizing,
stating that the actions of the army were unjustified and that the government was deeply sorry.
It was a massive moment.
An apology is historically significant, sure. But let's talk about actual justice. Let's talk about the courtroom. Because despite Lord Savile explicitly finding with forensic certainty that these soldiers committed unjustifiable killings and perjured themselves, only one anonymous paratrooper, known in the legal proceedings as Soldier F, ever faced murder charges.
And those charges related specifically to the murders of James Ray and William McKinney in Glenfada Park and the attempted murders of several others.
But the legal process following the inquiry was agonizingly slow.
It was subjected to endless delays, legal challenges, dropped cases over the admissibility of evidence regarding statements made decades prior, and eventually the process culminated in a recent not guilty verdict.
It's infuriating.
Yeah.
Across all these events, how common was it for the perpetrators of these crimes, whether the baton-wielding police in 1913, the traumatized paramilitaries at Croke Park in 1920, the IRA squad members who committed extrajudicial killings, or the paratroopers in Derry in 1972 to face meaningful justice?
Almost non-existent. When you look at the historical data, the accountability approaches zero.
Wow.
The state structures, the military tribunals, the internal police investigations, they are almost entirely designed to protect their own agents. When the military or police commit crimes in the name of restoring order, the administrative reflex is almost always to conceal the evidence.
To justify the violence as a regrettable necessity.
And to delay any legal process until the perpetrators are dead or the public has moved on.
Think about the political rhetoric we've seen even recently in the UK, with politicians pushing legislation to grant amnesty to veterans, claiming that state killings during the Troubles were not crimes, but acts of duty.
It's deeply controversial.
It is an absolute slap in the face to the families who spent half a century fighting for the truth. And you have to ask, with all these horrific crimes and the cover-ups, did anyone ever truly answer for what they did? Because it feels like a major theme of our deep dive today is justice delayed or just plain denied.
It is the ultimate tragedy of sovereignty. The state holds a monopoly on legitimate violence. When the state abuses that monopoly and turns that violence against its own unarmed citizens, the legal system rarely functions as a check on that power.
Right.
It requires immense, relentless, multi-generational pressure from civil society just to secure an admission of guilt, let alone actual legal accountability.
Yes, the families of the 1972 victims had to fight the entire apparatus of the British establishment for 38 years just to get a piece of paper saying their loved ones were innocent.
And the families of the 1920 victims had to wait 80 years for a locked filing cabinet to be opened.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, we have to look back at the dark ground we've covered today. These three bloody Sundays, 1913, 1920, and 1972, are linked by far more than just a coincidence of the calendar.
They are connected by a chilling, repetitive pattern of state violence.
They show us the mechanics of unchecked brutality against civilians, and they highlight the agonizing struggle for truth against official state narratives designed specifically to protect the powerful from the consequences of their crimes.
They show us the anatomy of the whitewash, how power operates when it is caught with blood on its hands. It doesn't confess, it deflects, it manipulates the press, it blames the victims for their own deaths, and it uses the very mechanisms of the legal system, tribunals, and inquiries to construct a false reality.
Being truly informed means confronting these uncomfortable realities. It means looking beneath the sanitized surface of history and recognizing how history is so often written by the people holding the guns. It means understanding how easily a day of rest, a sanctuary, can be turned into a nightmare of violence.
And it reminds us that justice is not a natural byproduct of the legal system. The arc of the moral universe doesn't bend toward justice on its own. It has to be fiercely dragged in that direction by the people left behind.
I want to leave you with a brand new concept to ponder as you go about your week. Think about the evolution of the witness. In 1913, during the lockout, all we had were the eyewitness accounts from impoverished working-class people accounts that were easily dismissed and ignored by the state apparatus.
Right.
In 1920, the truth of the Croke Park massacre was documented by military investigators, but it was hidden away in a locked filing cabinet for 80 years.
But in 1972, the dynamic shifted.
It did. Photojournalists like Gilles Perez were on the ground in Derry. They captured the undeniable visual reality of unarmed men being gunned down, a priest waving a bloodstained handkerchief.
And it was those specific haunting images that kept the fight for the civil inquiry alive.
They were the undeniable fragments of truth that the witchery whitewash couldn't completely erase. It makes you wonder, in our modern era, where every single person has a high-definition camera in their pocket, is the era of the official state whitewash finally over? Or have institutions just become more sophisticated at manipulating the images we see?
Technology changes the battlefield of truth, but the instincts of power to protect itself from accountability remain remarkably constant.
Sunday is supposed to be a day of peace. But for the families of the victims of 1913, 1920, and 1972, that peace was stolen by state violence and replaced with a century-long fight for the truth. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay critical, and we'll catch you next time.